Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts, the podcast that explores the devastating impact of witchcraft accusations and other harmful practices around the world. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
And I'm Sarah Jack. Our expert guest, Dr. Keith Silika, is a remarkable criminal investigator and lecturer whose work bridges the worlds of criminology, forensics, and human rights advocacy.
Born in Zimbabwe, Dr. Silika grew up around traditional healing practices through his father, who was both a healer and a devout Catholic. His career has taken him from police work in Zimbabwe to law enforcement and academics in England, giving him a unique blend of highly specialized expertise and experience.
This dynamic discussion of witchcraft-related harmful practices, forensic evidence, and innovative prevention strategies is unlike any other episode we have delivered so far. Welcome to the Thing About Witch Hunts podcast, Dr. Keith Silika. I'm so excited to have you here today. Can you introduce yourself and tell us about your expertise and work?
Thank you for having me, both of you. Very delighted to be here. So I've got a very long, ambiguous, and some people call interesting work profile. I'll keep it short. I don't know if you can tell from my accent, I was born in Zimbabwe. When I was young, when I was 21, I joined the police there. Worked for the police there for about 3 years. Before that, the background to the story is my dad used to be a healer, witch doctor. So I grew up around him seeing patients coming to the house. I grew up around ritual cleansing ceremonies. And then I joined the police when I was 21. And then when I immigrated to England, I joined the police again, worked for the police for about 12 years. And at the same time, I was doing a PhD. So I did studies in undergraduate in criminology, a master's in crimes investigation, and PhD in forensic science. And then I teach on the policing modules here in Salford.
Thank you. It's so good to be talking with you today. We met last year at the Witchcraft and Human Rights Conference at Lancaster University. Why is it important for conferences like that to be happening right now?
It was my first conference with the International Network. I must say that I'm a member of the International Network Against Harmful Practices. So it was actually my first time to present a paper on witchcraft and harmful practices in Zimbabwe and forensic evidence. So those conferences are quite important in terms of networking, in terms of research. Like I'm going to be talking about my research. So the network is going to be helping me out with my research. And then the network has helped me out to reach out to people like you. So it's quite important, those conferences, because they actually, while some of the things that we might discuss might be innocuous to other people, but in my context, there's actually victims and people that are embedded in some of the work that I do.
Thank you so much. Yeah, for us coming from the background in the United States, it really helped us to contextualize the little bit that we understand. And it was so important to meet you and others, and we're so glad you're here talking to us about your work. We would like to know more about Zimbabwe.
Oh, thank you very much. My research is I'm writing a book on witchcraft and harmful practices in the context of forensics and evidence and a bit of artificial intelligence. It will come together at some point. So Zimbabwe, any other colonial country, was a colony since the 1800s. Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Zambia used to be one country. Pretty much like Pakistan and India, they used to be one country, and they only separated in 1960, 61, 62. So they became three different countries: Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. So I appreciate the initial confusion as to which country.
Yeah.
So I'll be dipping into those. So both have got the same colonial history, and both have the same cultures, albeit different languages in different contexts. Both have the same issues around witchcraft and harmful practices around the same level. Both have colonial legislation around witchcraft, because obviously when the colonizers came in, they enacted what called the Witchcraft and Suppression Act of 1914, which banned the practice and belief of witchcraft. And when independence came into force in most of those countries, most of their legislation, as we launched the other day, I explained further, they tried to play around with the Witchcraft Suppression Act of those countries because there was new thinking and still old values and old cultures. So those are the issues that are embedded. So the issues about education, about legislation and culture also then affect the ritual killings and the investigation and the evidence and everything that comes with it.
What should we know about ritual killings?
In the context of Zimbabwe, ritual killings is whereby an individual is intentionally murdered for their body parts. So this happened. I've set up a system. I use Google Alert whereby I set up a system whereby there's a killing, I get an email or an article or any background to it. There's actually a ritual killing yesterday that I just received. So it's a ritual killing, is the harvesting of body parts on the belief that a certain body part will give you certain benefits. The eye of, for example, an albino child, the incident yesterday, this conversation is going to get gory, but we are within context.
Yeah.
Right? So yesterday,
Yeah.
killing involved killing of a 14-year-old and the harvesting of their sexual organs, example. And some ritual killings will take the liver, sometimes they'll take the ears. It depends on what's the agenda, what's the framing, what's the intention of the offender in that context. So these ritual killings are pretty much works around Africa in different contexts because of language and culture and location. Certain nuances in terms of the killing change because they are not uniform, because obviously we don't have books about it, which I'm hopefully trying to produce. Okay, these types of ritual killings are a result of this type of offender, this type of contact, and this type of investigation. The numbers are pretty difficult to ascertain because certain ritual murder or harmful practices can be disguised as something else. It could be a domestic violence, or it could be domestic violence that go other way. So those cases are very difficult for us to capture in terms of data. So that's one of the difficult paradigms when trying to encapsulate information around which are the types of killings. So we have to be very look into cases and just see, okay, there is this element, this element. So that's in essence the ritual killing and harmful killings within this context.
Thank you. That's such a great way to explain it. Thank you so much. Witchcraft beliefs drive this. What are those and how does it create the conditions for these attacks?
Oh, yes, so for several reasons. I'm always coming up with theories and things in my head when I'm looking at it. Why do they come about? And I call it like the burden of the African mind, whereby if somebody in Africa wants to make a decision about getting married, getting a job, doing everyday activities, they have to consider the rituals, the cultures, and sometimes most people belong to multiple kind of practices. For example, my father was a healer, but he also was Catholic. He never missed mass most of his life. So those are the kind of elements are there. So what causes this? I think for me, number one is socio-economic circumstances, because most of those areas, and as you will see in future when we bring me back when I'm talking about the book, and there's profiling in terms of the victims and offenders. So for me, number one is poverty. Most of these areas, those countries have got low GDP, low unemployment, lack of resources, etc. And as a result of that, the children don't go to school. For example, Zimbabwe was the highest number of childbirth for children 18 for quite a long time. And there's a report by the United Nations to that effect. So there's poverty, then lack of education, lack of resources, and social jealousy, because of we're in the age where people can see images of things and things like, okay, in order for me to get that, the novel ideas of people finding a job have been taken away by socio-economic circumstances. And miseducation as well is quite important, because I'm one of the people who grew up around it and I believed it because I've been told by my people, by my peers and by my elders and by my father, and also peer pressure within communities. Okay, you've got this element. You don't go to the local hospital, go and see this witch doctor, go and see this prophet, etc. And also another issue that perpetuates this practice is the lack of medical facilities. That's why people go and see healers or witch doctors, because they don't have access to proper medical facilities. So that's in essence an overview of some of the reasons that causes some of these practices.
How are the victims selected for ritual killings? Why are certain people targeted?
In order probably to explain that, I might introduce a criminological theory called the routine activities theory. It's called RAT. In order for an offense to occur, there has to be a suitable victim, a suitable target, and the lack of a capable guardian. Basically, if there's a opportunity for an offense to occur and there's no guardian, either in the form of police or local government infrastructure or knowledge, the chances of those type of offenses tend to occur. In terms of victim selection, it's quite based on reports and what I've seen so far. The primary at the moment, what seems to be, I think in the last 10 years, what seems to be the victims are actually murdered are mostly young boys and young girls, aged anything between the ages of 3 and 14. That seems to be the age in which those individuals are, the ones that are actually murdered are mostly, I would say maybe 60% female, 40% male between those ages. And the offender is normally 100% male within this context. It's normally a male age between 20 and 50. Yeah, that's the person who does the actual killing. But there's the third and fourth matrix that comes into play in the form of normally the person who does the killing. This is something I need to find out to ascertain. Normally, the person who does the killing, they have been commissioned by somebody else. Yeah, because that person who's doing the killing in 95% of the cases that I've seen, it's normally somebody who's unemployed, poverty, lack of education, maybe on a spectrum. I will ascertain that with my data. But normally, those are the kind of people. That individual does not have the constellation to meander that pathway. So another matrix that comes into play is normally a local business person or a coming business person or a popular individual within the community who wishes to enhance their outlook in terms of either property, money, economic circumstances. So those are normally the four kind of people involved. And so there's the killing, the actual killing, and then the ritual that comes after that. However, most people normally accused as witches are mostly women, as we know around the world. I think that's been outlined in your previous conversations there. Most of the people who are then convicted of being witches are women, and then the victims are mostly young children. And there's one or two people who might get away within that matrix. And also, I think the other thing that I wanted to touch on, it just escaped my mind, on the issue of the women. Yeah, for example, it gets reflected in law. For example, the Witchcraft Suppression Act of most of these Southern African states declare that witchcraft is not real, etc. However, new legislation that permit in some countries, for example, Zimbabwe, the Witchcraft Suppression Act of 2006 says witchcraft and harmful practices actually real and they exist. So the first conviction, for example, under that legislation was a female aged 21 in 2009. She was convicted of bewitching her in-laws by flying in a basket 100 miles away. And the court sentenced to that sentence based on her own play. So that's one example in which, that legislation and the issue of the matrix and the individuals are concerned.
Wow. Yeah. Can you clarify about the magic involved? So the good fortune that would come from the ritual or the bewitchment, does that have a diabolical religious element or is it different than that?
No, it's just, I was watching a different kind of podcast to make sense to the origins of some of the ideas to try and harvest some of these organs. Like different people, different beliefs can be geographically mapped. People in Africa were living around animals and they had to be aware of certain things, certain animals. They had to be more conscientious of their environment as opposed, for example, people living in Antarctica, they had to be worried about maybe 2 or 3 animals down there. So as a result of the complex nature of the environment, people started trying to make sense what can help them survive. Give an example, for example, over decades, the issue about, for example, the eye of the albino eye, a child for decades during hunting times was believed to confer powers so that you can hunt animals, if that makes sense. So there's this little aspects of things. For example, they would say that organs of a child can help men. They can be mixed with something and help men with impotence. And there's issues around even female young victims being ritually murdered, for example, HIV purposes and things like that. Then that's why I'm doing this kind of project, trying to streamline kind of these pockets of, okay, if this happens, this is what we're looking at and this is where it comes from. And also some of these types of murders and body parts change over time because, again, the investigative process within the police stops on arrest. There's no further understanding of, okay, where does this come from? Because there's a conflict on law, culture, or the suspects merely not saying anything, and then the investigation stops. So there's a gap within that context in order time to explain these little different body parts and what they're supposed to help in terms of they're helping like in real life, if that makes sense.
In your forensic analysis, is there a clear distinction between cases that are driven by genuine beliefs versus those where the ritual elements might be used to mask some other criminal motive for a robbery or a personal vendetta, maybe?
Yeah, because I want to say forensic analysis because I will not, because of ethics, it's quite difficult again to, that's why something I'm trying to reach out to certain governments who are friendly. But the problem with that is some of the data is muddled and it cannot really be properly analyzed. Even the one that goes to court is very much muddled. So to answer to your question, yes, there are, as I mentioned previously at the start, there are crimes that normally start, for example, as a land dispute. And then another person goes to find a witch doctor to try and get the other person to either give up land or not speak to them or even kill them. And then it will start as a land dispute, and then the doctor gets involved, and then another young person gets recruited to do the actual killing because, as I mentioned previously, most of the offenders are pretty much unemployed, normally else on the spectrum, etc. And then what normally happens in that offense becomes muddled. For example, the case that I was talking about that happened yesterday, about the killing of a 14-year-old child. We don't have more information in regards the other offender. When I was mentioning my theory on who's the other people involved, we don't have that information. And those people are in most cases that I've seen, there's even open cases that you can watch on YouTube whereby the information is not given up by the offender in most of the cases. Right? Even some of torture techniques that I found in Zimbabwe, most of that information is not that well known. Yes, it's difficult because there's so much evidence of a lack of a lack of information in some cases, a dent of information in some cases, to actually label certain crimes that have been done in certain ways. That's why I come in with this type of research that I'm trying to do.
Yeah. We find when we're looking through incidents that happen here, or if you find a documentary done about a serial killer in U.S. history, often those who are analyzing it don't know quite what to make of if there's occult signs or evidence of Satan worship. Sometimes it really is blamed on that. Other times it's recognized, oh, that was part of the perpetrator's tactics to create his persona. So it is really interesting to see how these are very different contexts, what I mentioned and what you're describing, but there is always, it's hard to pin it down sometimes. So thanks for sharing that, because it really helps me reflect on what I see when we're looking at crimes here. And is there anything else you'd want to share about forensics?
I just add a bit of a note on that. And there are also harmful practices in which, to answer your question, a religious element is involved. So whenever a religious element is involved, all the suspects tend to appear clear. To give an example, there was a harmful religious killing last week whereby a prophetess took somebody who was on ADHD spectrum. They gave him a concoction, prayed for him, but the concoction killed that person. So they buried that person at the shrine. the 6 of them. However, when the police got involved because of missing person, they all got arrested and all confessed. They were all clear in terms of what they were doing within that context. So I'll add the note that when it's involved ritual killings, that's the other problem, is the police also have also their biases and stuff, so it doesn't come into effect. And in terms of forensics, there's so many parameters that need to be looked at in terms of the types of evidence that's given. Because when we talk about forensic evidence, we're looking at DNA, fiber, hair, soil, digital evidence, liquid evidence, all sorts of biological evidence. So in terms of the ritual murders that normally occur in Zimbabwe, there's in general within those countries, there's lack of forensic facilities. The main one is in South Africa, for example. For example, Malawi, Zambia, they send most of their forensic analysis to South Africa, the big ones, and the small cases, they deal with them. When we are looking at evidence, we're looking at the Lockhart principle that every contact leaves a trace. Whenever a ritual murder occurs, because, for example, yesterday there was blood, there was fiber, there was the instruments that were used by the individual. And in contemporary context, we've got mobile phone data that can come into play as well in some of those cases. So all those parameters are very much often missing. What also adds the complexity of the crime scenes within ritual murder is the presence of charms, bracelets, and other liquids and objects. Because very often when you can see some of this stuff on YouTube, very often some of the liquids are found there are blood cautions which have been mixed with several people, for example, as like a power matrix. So that can complicate the crime scene in my context. If I'm to go to that scene and swap that scene and I get 26 DNA profiles, there needs to be an analysis and understanding and a protocol as a result of that. For example, using that same example, and this has been played several times, where a ritual incident is occurred and there's loads of blood that's been found. Even lack of profiles not being done on certain objects. For example, there are what called popular healers in these countries. They go around in villages healing people. Sometimes things go wrong, and these people carry with them evidence from one area to another through the objects that they carry, number one, through the contacts that they do, through the signature rituals that they do. So those are the type of things that I'll be looking into and say, listen, you can have evidence from a ritual scene that you've been looking for from a year ago. So this is something that we in the Western world will probably see on Netflix, but some people in different countries have got no idea how much forensic has moved forward in terms of prevention and detection of these ritual murders in this context.
You mentioned prevention, and that has me curious. What techniques are there available to prevent these kinds of attacks?
Yeah, so again, this is something I'm working on. One of the main things I'll be looking at is using artificial intelligence around mapping. I'd like to, for example, map the different body parts and train an AI model, and implement so that it can be used by police forces. Because at the moment, it's a bit haphazard in terms of trying to come up with patterns. We know the offenders, but the body part area has not been partly been looked at because people just actually 3 days ago, there was a young lad in the center of Harare was found with a uterus, walking around selling a uterus. So they arrested him for interfering with body parts. How did he get that uterus to that place, and what sort of pattern are we looking at? Is this a different type of pattern that we're seeing at the moment? So those are the areas that can be quite problematic to look at. That's why I'm trying to do this project, so I can be able to offer more answers to kind of those nuances.
Yeah. Wow. You have mentioned a few times about traditional healers in that role. Can you tell us what the positive and the benefits of having those practitioners in the communities?
Yeah, so those practitioners have evolved over time. They used to shift, and then used to be now people used to be now elected. In the case, for example, this research is semi-ethnographical because it should be to my father, even though I've got to be honest, he knew that I'd changed because I joined the police, and he knew my PhD. I unfortunately passed away 3 years ago. And there are different types of these healers found in the community. If I'm to describe, my father specialized in fertility, for example. He was well known as the fertility guy in the country because at one point he was the Secretary General of the Healers Association of the country. He had like thousands of pictures of children that had helped couples conceive. So that element in terms of, for example, in his healing room, he had hundreds of powders for various things. And my idea at the moment there still was, I wanted to do some tests on them because it's not only him who had that. There's hundreds of healers that have different powders. So some of them work, what I've seen, and then some of them, it doesn't work because there's a lack of testing. If you go on YouTube, you can type in street medicine Harare. You can see loads of people with various powders in Harare for if somebody's got ED, you want a wife, you want a husband, you want all sorts of things. So there's the powder stuff, and then there's the trickery stuff. So a lot of those stuff are not investigated. A lot of stuff is being utilized because I noted recently that, for example, moringa is now a trend in the southern. I don't know if you know this moringa powder. It contains like 87 different components of vitamins. It's now a trendy in trendy shops. But that's been used in Africa by traditional healers, not knowing without analysis that, oh, this powder actually worked on a lot of spectrum. So a lot of stuff is not tested. That's why I was challenged. I was talking to my friend because I'm coming around to how some of the things, what we can help. So one area that will help what I'll be doing, the forensic investigation, the evidence, the pattern analysis, all that fancy stuff. Yes. But the only problem, sometimes it cannot be well received. So I just did a blog I found this fantastic organization called the Friendship Bench. And I've been told it's actually one in Colorado, one in Washington, and one in Tennessee. So a Friendship Bench was started by a professor here in London, but he was born in Zimbabwe. The idea was local aunties who have grown with wisdom and knowledge, give them a bench, train them a bit around mental health and identifying certain mental health traits. Those aunties are in the community. You go on the bench, you sit on that bench, you speak to these aunties, they talk to you because those kind of wisdom that's embedded with contemporary knowledge on healthcare. So it's won an award. This Friendship Bench is actually the Princess Trust here in England is one of the endorsers of the project. So I ran the Manchester 10K. Then I realized one of my results will be probably embed some sort of training with some of these aunties because within contemporary content, they have more power. People respect them. So I'm envisaging a situation whereby an individual, a rumor that started that saying, oh, you've been bewitched. No, can you go and see the auntie, please? They don't see the auntie. Auntie is not a traditional healer. She's not a herbalist. She's going to take this information objectively and steer an individual in the right way, if that makes sense. So those will be my possible outputs, like a community embedded process for some of these, because some of these individuals don't want to go to, for example, to the hospitals. They don't want to some of them don't even have internet access, for example. So these are the kind of community aunties for me that are going to be like a good signature in my book, because I think it makes sense within that context.
That's amazing. I'm looking forward to learning more about that, learning everything about that, because that's news to me. So I'm really excited to learn about it.
I'm quite glad my university actually have given me a bench, a friendship bench, whereby lonely students who are away from home. We've got American students here from everywhere who don't have any friends. You can go to the bench. It's in a public, secure area. Scan a QR code. Speak to somebody there. You'll be signposted other benefits that you can get, etc. You can make friends there, etc. I'm quite excited that I'm launching it in September. And I'm quite ambitious because I don't know if Stevie Bartlett, he films the diary of a CEO next to my university. So I've made a cheeky request for him to come and open my bench. Yeah, so that's going to be an important output for me in terms of the friendship benches, like linking those in terms of prevention and detection as well.
That's amazing. And when are you doing your opening of your bench?
My opening of my bench is most likely in September because that's when the university calendar here starts. It's something that it didn't cost me any money because the building was being renovated. And I emailed the facilities like, oh, Keith, you are a witch doctor or something. I was like, why? It's like, we were looking at what to do with that area there. We've got nothing to do. I was like, put my bench there. So they put the bench there. I'll send you an article with the background
Yeah.
information around that. So that's basically why I meant in terms of this research. So I'm looking at the forensics aspect of witchcraft practices using contemporary lens. And also I'll be coming up also, I want to come up with like a theory, like a ritual ecological or theory whereby I want to challenge individuals' beliefs using technology to mirror whether you believe or not. I'm going to have to use a tool that speaks to both, a tool that speaks to your belief and a tool that speaks to science. And for me, AI was the thing that can say, listen,
Yeah.
if you want to do this in terms of these ritual murders and etc. And also I want to support the UN resolution on witchcraft and harmful practices. Is a lot of the UN resolution also come with guidelines. For example, the UN resolution on genocide has got investigation guidelines. So a UN resolution on harmful practices can produce guidelines to support that. So that kind of marries those two items together.
That's all really remarkable to hear about. Thank you for all your efforts on that. The working with the aunties really sounds very important because they're often at the center of these accusations. And if they can identify when it's a mental health thing and that kind of things, but also just with regular medical concerns, they can be taught, okay, I can help with this, but for this, you need to go to the hospital. And they can tell people that. So
Absolutely.
I really,
The idea of the aunties was not in my mind up until, because every year I ran for a different charity. So when I ran for this, I was like, I wonder if this is work. So the person who found it is such a fascinating story. I encourage you, I encourage you to look up his book. I'll send you some links to his new book that describes the
you.
whole process and how even in some states in America, because there were issues about, for example, I was in a call when they were doing the launch of the book, there were issues around diabetes, I think in Tennessee, whereby individuals say, oh, it runs in the family, it's your uncle. But I say, like, the aunties are saying, no, you're drinking too much cooler, you're doing this. So they were going to these aunties and it's like speaking a different language now. I say, listen, no, it's not witchcraft. No, this is not in your family. You need to change this and that. I think it's going to be my favorite charity for quite a long time because they've got training package, which some of them is available for free, individual to download. So mine is going to be digital based platform whereby when the students scan a code, they've got conversation starters, they can be signposted, they can join a cricket club, anything that can just signpost them quickly whilst there. So that's a different context in regards to that.
That is awesome. I'm really excited to read your blog. I saw that you had posted it a few days ago and I haven't read it yet, but I had mentioned it to Josh. I'm like, he ran for something. He's excited about it. We need to find out what that was. And I'm thrilled to hear what it is. You mentioned the UN resolutions, and with the work that you do, there must be so many that intersect with your work.
At the moment, no, because I've been scouring for other people doing a PhD. Because as a member of the international network, I'm trying to get like academics who are doing PhDs. Within the forensic context, at the moment, I would say no, because I've been looking quite a bit. There's no guideline, for example, because I was quite fortunate. For example, when we met, the commissioner for that resolution was there. I managed to speak to her last week. I think I might see her next week. We're launching a witchcraft film in London next week. For example, she was telling me like we don't have the guidelines. I say, okay, I'll produce the guidelines for you. I'm always looking for other people doing research of witchcraft in different contexts. So at the moment, it looks like me, but I don't know what I don't know.
Yeah.
yeah, I'm curious. In addition to we know about of course, the UN resolution on the witchcraft related harmful practices. Are there other UN resolutions that cover ritual attacks or any of these other crimes that are happening?
Not that I can think of on the top of my head, but there are other human international protocols against disappearing people being disappeared, for example. So there are several UN protocols that cover, for example, as I mentioned previously, the UN Charter on Genocide Investigation is covered by what called the Minnesota Guidelines. So at the moment, within this niche area, there isn't much in that, but in every UN protocol normally is embedded with some other guidelines in terms of either investigation or victims. For example, the albino kind of protocols, there's some stuff there. Violence against women and girls, genital mutilation, they all have resolutions there, then a guideline there that's embedded.
And developing that guideline really means hitting definitions head on and finding those acceptable terminologies and considerations of spiritual beliefs, doesn't it?
Correct. And also have to consider languages, and as semantics. Some words don't exist that are languages. It would be me maybe with an AI or maybe using my own witchcraft, create new kind of phrases, which people are doing actually, because certain phrases don't exist in those kind of areas in which I'm looking at as well.
Yeah. I have really enjoyed I see you post about your work on LinkedIn. I'm a LinkedIn user and fan. I just think it's so critical for professionals, especially people who are advocating for humanity. Thank you for showing your work on there. But I really do enjoy seeing you talk about AI because I think you're demonstrating the power for good of it. And even though you're just beginning to pull together what these projects are going to be, you're trailblazing with AI. That's amazing.
You said a very interesting word this. I don't know. Again, I'm going to assign this to Witchcraft. Liverpool University Press have got a Trailblazers Award. And guess who got it?
Did you get it?
I got the Trailblazers Award. Yes.
Congratulations,
Thank you
Dr.
very
Silika.
much. Yeah, it's 10 of us who get the Trailblazers Award. It's given to unusual research subjects. So in my cohort, we've got Palestinian poets. We've got somebody who's looking at the use of menstrual blood art. So we've got a very quirky project. I'm doing witchcraft. Somebody's doing Brexit within immigrants. Another is doing small boats. It's very interesting trailblazers. So those are the ones that are sponsoring the book. Hopefully.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's very magical that I thought that. Wow.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I was curious, the Pan-African Parliament issued some guidelines around harmful practices related to witchcraft accusations. How did those fit into this whole puzzle?
To be fair, the African Union, they've got several human rights protocols and guidelines. And I'm aware, for example, certain countries do not sign them. For example, Zimbabwe is not signatory to the International Convention Against Missing Persons within the UN and also within the AU. So I don't know, there are certain specific protocols and guidelines to which certain countries simply do not sign based on what's happening in their country, based on the types of leaders they've got. And also even instances whereby Zimbabwe is signatory to all the UN conventions against violence against women, etc. And yet there is more violence against women in the country, and there's not much noise or the use of that protocol within that context. So the legislation and protocols can exist sometimes and sometimes cannot be implemented.
What else would you like to make sure that we understand about this amazing work, about the children, or anything else that we need to really consider when we're learning about this?
Yeah, I think for me, ritual within the context of the areas that I'll be looking at, ritual and harmful practices are weaponized against women, children, political opponents, neighbors. So they are used as a weapon by anybody to do harmful practices. And also issue of labeling is quite prominent because it's quite innocuous that over here you can give each other nicknames. But in certain countries, labeling somebody witch, like in Zambia and Malawi, can end somebody in court based on something that's flimsy. If you look at the current state, the current case in Zambia between the different political parties, in which one party is claiming they were trying to kill them using this few object, and that case has been in court for over a year in Supreme Court. So there's weaponizing of the law against political opponents, and also clogging up the justice system. And also another issue that's important is there's some definitions and the ambiguity of both the investigation and the legislation. In terms, for example, in Zambia, they don't allow, they repeal the Witchcraft Suppression Act, and yet they're taking somebody to court over something that they already appealed. So those are some of the issues that concern. And also, there's lack of material evidence. And if there is evidence, it's evidence that no offense to everybody, you and I would love it. For example, the case I mentioned about Regina's fatal case about the basket. These are fairy tales that we read in book. So the material evidence within those cases is very problematic, and it needs to be unpacked. And also, in certain instances, there's an issue about expert witness testimony, when expert on witchcraft with no time, with no book or any investigation shows up and they give evidence about certain things based on conjecture, really. So that's problematic. So those are the areas that will also be looking at holistically, and hopefully in the end produce something that can be used for human rights activists, police, courts, and also maybe possibly the UN in terms of the guidelines. So that's what I'm hoping.
Yeah,
You
thank
will.
you.
You will.
Yeah, you will. I'm curious, you talked about types of evidence and how some of it's probably preposterous. We've been looking into what was the evidence used in witch trials. So it just has me curious, what kind of evidence would be produced in court to accuse someone of flying in a basket?
For example, the Zambia case, if I'm not mistaken, the evidence that's been presented is some liquid in a bottle, and I think it's frog that got away. In some instances, it's just shells, beads, made up masks with various objects on them. Some objects with skull, like with anatomical looking objects, some of them real, some of them pseudo real. And again, this is on what I'm hoping to collect a bit further, just to map these things, like how do they, because if I can get some data from the courts, for example, some of the stuff that's been taken to court, if I can photograph it and just use some AI again to help me out on that one, because that'll be quite quicker to just map things and say, giving more understanding. Because some of the evidence is very dubious and very insidious because it's mostly made up stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was also wondering about that evidence. So there is a limited amount of physical evidence. Is there also just a lot of testimony from the accusers and hearsay, conjecture? Or do those things come into play?
Pretty much, yes. And that's what, for example, it's unfortunate for a country like Zimbabwe, they've actually made it into law with the Witchcraft Suppression Act of 2006, that an accusation is valid reason for somebody to be taken to court based on no evidence. It could be hearsay evidence, and also it could be expert witness evidence, as I mentioned. And also within the matrix, what called healers, Pentecostal, flamboyant healers come into the matrix as well, because Zimbabwe is quite popular with those as well. They often will be consulted, so as to say, or they can voice an opinion and that can be actually be valid. So so evidence, very dubious. There's lack of physical examination of the evidence in addition as well. For example, you can do certain analysis on certain types of things in terms of fiber analysis, blood analysis, weigh the objects, scan the objects, take a sample of the object. All those things are not really looked at into detail.
Yeah. Thank you. What do you see happening with that law? Do you see it staying in play for a while, or do you think it'll be contested? And
think
evolve?
the context of those countries, because there's the human rights, most of the human rights groups in Southern Africa have got what called fatigue in terms of going into courts, but they are very clever people who are willing to do that kind of work. If I'm given the opportunity, I don't mind looking into that. I've done all the work. That will be the next stage really for me to, if I can challenge it constitutionally based on evidence that I've accrued, that would be quite also useful.
Yeah, thanks. This was really amazing. I feel very fortunate that we were able to learn from your expertise about this, and we appreciate that you came today and answered these questions and helped us to understand what can be done.
No, thank you for having me and keep up the good work. And looking forward to this podcast and the others. I'll try and catch up with a few as I go along because I need to be up to date as well in what's happening. And please signpost to me anybody who's doing any research, who wants to get in touch with me and they've got an aspect maybe I've not looked at or they've got interesting angle that I might not be aware of. I'm more than happy to have a chat and then liaise.
Awesome.
Definitely. Thank you so very much.
Cheers. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Sarah.
Join our organization End Witch Hunts live on World Day Against Witch Hunts to learn from leading experts about the survivors of witchcraft accusations in Ghana outcast camps.
Sunday, August 10th, End Witch Hunts Events is bringing together specialists from Amnesty International, the Sana Institute, the Total Life Enhancement Center Ghana, ActionAid, and Sangtaba for a crucial discussion on supporting survivors of witchcraft accusations with a special focus on women and children in Ghana's outcast camps.
The World Day Against Witch Hunts isn't just about history. It's about understanding a crisis happening right now. Vulnerable people, especially women and children, still face violence and exile due to witchcraft accusations in communities that desperately need our support.
This is your opportunity to learn directly from researchers, advocates, and organizations working directly in these communities to address their needs.
Events are happening globally to honor this day of remembrance and education. Please share the event details with your network.
You can register for free at endwitchhunts.org/day. This event will help you gain insights that can help turn awareness into meaningful action.
Because understanding and then starting an important conversation is where meaningful change starts.
Hear the special expert panel Sunday, August 10th, 2025 at 5:30 p.m. GMT, that's 1:30 p.m. EDT. Find the link to this free online webinar at endwitchhunts.org/day. Come check us out on the Thing About Salem podcast and join us on our Patreon for bonus content and chat.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.